Welcome to the Church Dropout podcast. My name is Alan. I'm the host. Thank you so much for tuning into the podcast. Church Dropout is a podcast where we talk about all the reasons why people walk away from the Christian church, or the American church, I should say, and sometimes their faith, and offer hope to those who are re-exploring faith from the margins. I want to real quickly address some of the myths and misconceptions that are happening in conversations about people who are walking away from the church. And the reason why it's important to have this conversation, obviously, is because if we misdiagnose the problem, then we also mistreat it, right? And that's what's happening. I feel like there's a lot of conversation that's going on about people who've walked away from the church. There's a lot of articles being written. There's a lot of content being produced, but I'm not sure all of that is really getting at what people are feeling. So I want to go over some myths and misconceptions that I've experienced and I've read and I've heard concerning people who've walked away from the church. And so there's 6 things that I want to mention here. It's going to be pretty quick, but there's 6 things I want to mention as a result of that. So let's get into it. So myth number 1 is that people who walk away from the American church want to sin. People who walk away from the church want to sin. And to me, this is foolishness, if I could be honest with you. I think it's a very shallow understanding of why people are walking away from the church. Listen, people don't have to leave church to sin, and they don't. As a former pastor, I can attest to that. People don't need to walk away from the church to sin, and they don't. Now, I think this is more towards, if I can be honest, I think when this is actually being said, it's pointed more towards alternate lifestyles. People feel like there's people who are leaving the church because they want to engage in different lifestyles. And I think this myth is kind of aimed towards that. But overall, people are not walking away from church to sin. That is not what, I have experienced, both personally and in the conversations that I've been a part of. Again, because people can sin while they're in church. So, myth number 2, people who walk away from the church want to avoid the hard stuff. They want to avoid the hard stuff. They don't want to engage or wrestle with the issues or, the hard things that are happening within the American church. And again, this is also a myth. Long before people walk away from the church, it's an idea, it's a thought. And I'm sure most people who've thought deeply about it have had conversations, have wrestled with their leadership communities. Before they've walked away, it's been a long process. And so I would say that most people who've walked away from the church have engaged in the hard stuff, and they've engaged in the things that are difficult to walk through in community, those difficult conversations. Now, again, this is not everyone, but I would say that those who are walking away for the right reasons have engaged in these conversations. And let's be honest, the church today is not very welcoming when it comes to certain conversations about pillars or the topics and the teachings that are held very dear when it comes to the church. And so having conversations around some of these things can be very difficult. You could be seen a certain way by leadership. And I've been in this position, where you feel like you have a conversation about something and you're seen as being negative. You're seen as being, confrontational or, and so it's a myth. People who walk away from the church are not trying to avoid the hard stuff. The truth is most people have engaged in it. The church just hasn't responded. And most people feel like there's no other option but to seek other forms of worship. Myth number 3 is losing their faith. That people who walk away from the church are losing their faith or have lost their faith. And again, this is not true. In my experience from the conversations that I've had and, from engaging in certain spaces where people are struggling with these type of things, they're not walking away from the church because they've lost their faith. Most people are walking away from the church to preserve their faith. And, for a lot of people, the church has become a hindrance to spirituality. And that could be because of the things that are happening in the church, and that could be because of the structure of the church. But again, most people that I've experienced and honestly that I've read on who are really engaging in this conversation, they're not walking away from the church losing their faith because they're losing their faith. They're walking away from the church to preserve it. All right, myth number 4. I may have lost count here, but anyway, myth number 4. People who walk away from the church have a low view of church and community. And this is, again, as they're all myths, is not true. Um, you know, this argument generally comes from individuals in certain camps where the local church, the local gathering of the church is central to the, I guess, preserving of the gospel. And anybody who leaves this method or this type of gathering is seen as having a low view of church, right? And for some people, these individuals, I guess, that would be feeling this way, they really hang their hats on a certain style of preaching, a certain style of worship, very heady when it comes to working out the gospel and the things of salvation. And anybody who wants to leave that particular form or the American form to a large degree of church is seen as having a low view of church and or community. And that's not true. I think the other part of this is that some people want to be alone, that people are walking away from community or walking away from the church because they just don't want to be a part of a community. And again, I think both of those things are false. There is nothing more lonely than walking out your faith and struggling through questions about your faith by yourself. It is crazy. And there was a season where I, did that. I had some people around me, but they couldn't fully understand, and I couldn't fully articulate everything that I was experiencing or everything that I was feeling. And it wasn't because I had a low view of church or because I had a low view of community that I was walking away. And I just needed to figure some things out. And then the other part is perhaps people who are walking away from the church are walking away because they have a high view of church and community. And maybe what they're experiencing in the church is not the view of church that they see resonates with them and what they see in scripture. And so it's a myth and a misconception that people who walk away from church have a low view of church and community and things like that. So myth number 5, I believe, and this is kind of, similar to the last, but people who walk away from church have a low view of scripture, theology, and the things of God. Um, Again, there's this idea that people who see things a certain way when it comes to the church and or theology, that somehow they are viewing God less than, or they don't invest in their understanding of the faith. Like I was reading some articles, published by, like the Gospel Coalition and places like that. And the emphasis seems to be on like the way to preserve, your faith, or the way to preserve your relationship with the church is to get a better understanding of it. And it's kind of condescending, to be honest with you. It's making the assumption that people who walk away from church are not studied, they're not learned, that they, don't respect or have a reverence, it's just a tiring conversation. I think continues to happen, and it, really does push people further to the margins. And I think we need to be careful about how we have these conversations and the conversations we have. But the people who are walking away from the church, again, could have a very high view of these things, which is pushing them to the margins. And I'll say this, and perhaps in the future I'll speak on this a bit more. It's been my experience that a majority of the people that are walking away from the church are not walking away from their faith. In fact, they're not walking away from Jesus. They're walking away from church in search of Jesus. And so most people are responding to the form of American church. And I'm not just talking about how we do it, it's even the thought process. And this is on both sides. This is not what some would say liberal thinking or conservative thinking, because both have their issues. And or yeah, both have their issues, and I think both feed into this idea of what church is in America. And I think a lot of people are walking away from the form of church and what they see happening across the landscape of Christian culture. And lastly, one of the myths and misconceptions that people often make assumptions about people who walk away from the church is a lack of commitment, or that these individuals are weak. And yeah, it's just sad, to put this label on people that walk away, that they have a lack of commitment. And I think it's insensitive to a large degree too, right? Because we're not taking into to account why people are walking away. We would be cautious about telling someone to stay committed to a relationship or community um, where they're experiencing abuse, right? Or to stay committed in a relationship where it's difficult for them to engage Jesus because of what's in front of them. Let me give you an example. I was going through a very difficult time in my spiritual walk where I experienced some church hurt, and I decided to stay within this community. And the hurt that I experienced was from a leader. And every Sunday I had to fight. I had to fight through my own thoughts in order to see God, because everything that was said from the pulpit by this leader, I had to run it through this filter of goodness, all of the things that I'm thinking. Let's perhaps he said something that wasn't true for me in the experience that I had, and I'm wrestling, and then I'm becoming judgmental, and it wasn't healthy. I shouldn't have been there. I shouldn't have been there, and it wasn't fair to them, and it wasn't fair to me for the healing that needed to take place. But I felt like if I left, then I would have a low commitment. I'm not willing to engage this situation, and that's not true. And to walk away from a situation in order to gain perspective and to get healthy is not weak. It's wise. And you have a lot of people who are walking away from the church, not because they're not committed, not because they're weak, but because they're wise, and they want to bring about healing in their own person, without limitations. And they want to make sure that they're hearing from the Lord as they do so. And so, why put yourself in a situation where you're going to be hearing or seeing or having to wrestle through certain feelings and emotions and even people, and when you're trying to hear from God, so that's it. Those are just 6 misconceptions. I'm sure that there are many more. If you know of more, drop them below, and perhaps we could talk about them. And yeah, that's it. Thank you so much for tuning into the Church Dropout podcast. Please like, rate, and subscribe wherever you're listening. And talk to you soon. God bless.